congratulate you, people of East Timor, for the courage and perseverance you have shown.
Rekonsiliasaun passado sa história Hamutu kobel musinasaun seluk mai Foliman bamalu di foti itarain Hili liderança ho itania consciência Atuku nolialos reforça justisa Valoriza democracia la con discriminação Selori itaba governação nebe forti Badinas ba escola o dibuka lai matene Hari zerasaun nebe forte no saudável Pinta itania moriso itania creatividades Toca ita moriso espírito liberdade A tudo ba mundo itarai nebe furat A tudo ba mundo itarai o axolo Afeto forte Pronto forte
Tinan-20 né, tudo avanços, progressos, barak tebes.
Pronto a soro evolução, no progressos que desenvolvimento ser bem maclau de dar um jeito nerai.
Feito a participação, a liderança é responsável, ativo, nós bem informado, ele contribui para a boa governação, uma condição fundamental para o desenvolvimento sustentável.
É uma rota bela reta moris dia, paz e 20 anos mais, há no ainda nem mehi nebe Timor Oansira, hakarak vai uma rota.
É uma rota e é potencial a tu contribuir para o desenvolvimento nacional.
Timor sai referência, sai exemplo e ita Timor Oansira orgulhoso los, Nações Unidas orgulhoso los o conquista né.
Hau ia orgulho botida, barro ne povo do Timor Leste né, nebe Honinha coragem, bota tebes, honinha fé, honinha dedicação, toma, roto luta para tu bela to Iha Pontu-de-Vista.
Nações Unidas, ho Timor Leste e a relação Tinan-20 resingona, liuba kotuk antes do referendo 99, Nações Unidas marca hamutu koita, ho Portugal, Indonésia, a negociação para realização referendum ia 99 e algo ia levar tempo na vaqueda estou em Nações Unidas há muito na fato ita instituição ida que é importante teve baita.
It's a great pleasure to congratulate the people of Timor Leste on the 20th anniversary of the restoration of independence. On behalf of the UN country team, I offer the warmest wishes on this momentous occasion. Today's anniversary marks another landmark in the productive and exemplary partnership between Timor Leste and the United Nations. For more than 2 decades, the United Nations has worked side by side with the people of Timor Leste, supporting the country's efforts to build a strong and resilient state and promote sustainable peace and prosperity. I congratulate the new President of Timor-Leste, His Excellency Dr. José Ramos Horta, on his inauguration. I wish him every success as the country consolidates progress, fosters democratic governance, promotes human rights and sustainable development. Viva Timor-Leste!
Então, how considera ana nessa Timor wan hirak nebe nessa ema nebe maka sorti vida ida ne tamba considera Bispo Gunnar Stalsett nessa amigo ida que desde basic tina rua nulo ona maka cada tina na minha soru malu hodi bele koalia halo esposo todo para bele koalia soru malu koalia quando ba assunto ética moral dilema sira lideranças nian pai hanoi quando ba paz mundial paz global e nia nessa mentor ida ba bahaurasi. Então considera nessa mos amigo boti de Timor Leste Nian. Então ita ia sorte itu ia continua a manter relação ida ne ho bispo Gunnar Stalsett. Então ho ida ne maka iniciativa ida o Loron mos a convida futuras lideranças ser ida convida futuras lideranças Timor Nian e liderança atual mos geração fonsera Nian. Atu ita bele a oportunidade atu truca ideias truca Hanoi para ita hareliu vai assunto ida 20 anos foi no Kunan depois liderança tipo de visão saída mas que cara que tu que ela vai ter rai não que ela vai ter sociedade futuro mas para ele nem precisa parceria foi ensaio sira ou mentor sira para ver a halo discussão sira nessa né para ver ele colher o cliente quando o futuro na saúde nem hoje então hoje né without I'd like now to give the floor. I'll start with Professor Starla to give a remark. So you'll have about 30-something minutes. Then we'll open for questions and answers. Then afterwards, I'll also allocate about an hour for Bishop Gunnar to also give his views. Now, just a reminder, feel free to ask questions about any questions that you might have. And if you have issues or concerns about world peace initiatives regionally, then you feel free to ask either one of them. And I think later that will be able to shed light on some intricacies of some processes in the world. But I'll start with Professor Starla. Please, the floor is yours. Yeah, please.
very rich. I personally have been reflecting on and working in many contexts on the concept and experience of vulnerability. There has been, during the last decade, a renewed approach to both the experience and the theoretical or practical concept of what extreme vulnerability means, how we should think about it, and how we should work on the basis of our experience of vulnerability. And I think autonomy and vulnerability in interesting ways complement each other and challenge. To a certain extent, they are also a kind of tension. Can you listen? Can you hear me well at the back of the room? Is it okay? Please, if you want me to speak up, say that. So, my idea is to reflect with you on this. I'm not coming to you as an expert on your experience. I'm rather wanting, quite in a with humility, to share with you some of the thoughts that I've been working on in my research and from also my practical and professional experience. And I hope that we can have a good conversation on the basis of this. What does really the interaction of, or the interface between vulnerability and autonomy mean in this historical moment for East Timor and for the world as such? And I happen to believe that the Timorese experience is very unique and painful, but also full of promise. And that is something to build upon and something to share throughout the world, actually, that the Timorese experience and you as Timorese have something important to contribute to the global conversation about what political autonomy and vulnerability means in our day. So that is my key claim and wish today. Now you may ask what this has to do with theology. Political theology is part of my approach, and I hope that will become clear as I speak. I will not speak a lot about religion or theology indirect, but political theology is a reflection in many dimensions. It is a reflection on the ways in which religious concepts, pre-understandings, and what philosopher Charles Taylor calls social imaginaries, background that is not always explicit, but that we interpret our experiences through. Religious resources are always important as part of that background. And as part of our motivations and our ways of interpreting our being in the world. And that's why political theology, in some sense, can be seen as a way to lay open those background understandings that are theologically or religiously motivated and inspired. And I think that our reflections on autonomy and vulnerability too has this multifaceted religious background. Not just one, for instance, the Christian Catholic, but also a variety of traditional beliefs and of other background beliefs that feed into our understanding and our practices. So it is in that sense that I approach this from the perspective of political theology. So, what could be said about autonomy? What does it mean in the world today to be autonomous? As you may know, the concept in itself is not very difficult as a language. The linguistic background of it is, of course, Greek, autos, self, nomos,
law. So it's to give oneself one's own law. It is to govern based on one's own deliberation. We know this concept goes far back into philosophy, and of course we're perhaps most familiar with the concept as something emerging from the Enlightenment philosophy, and in particular of the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who used to say that being a mature person, Fidelis was mentioning leadership as something important, being a person that can be a leader is actually to become autonomous in the sense that we are able to give ourselves the law from which we will govern, understanding that law as a law that could be valid for all and that could be good for all. So that is the sort of moral obligation that we take upon ourselves when we, according to that concept of autonomy, are mature, our leaders, our subjects in the world, autonomous, you know. And that from that way of understanding autonomy, as you can see, we move from a personal level to a political level. That has been done since the beginning of political theory, going back to the Greek philosophers, Aristotle, who spoke about friendship as the core essence of political community, or Hobbes, Thomas Hobbes, the English philosopher, speaking of the natural condition as a war of all against all, and the fair, and you know. So the reflection upon personal experiences as a basis for political concepts and political praxis is very old. And that's what we continue to do when I also will approach vulnerability as basis for political community, right? But the problem with the traditional or the philosophical concept of autonomy in the Kantian version or later developments of that is that it is too self-centric. It is too auto. It is, in some sense, enclosed in oneself. And we all know that we can't live like that. None of us can live without the presence of the other. There is a sense in which speaking about or thinking about the total independence or self-centeredness or self-determination of a human person is bound to forget all that is important in a person's life. You know, from our birth to our death, we are dependent upon the work of others, the care of others, the presence of others, be they our near parents or siblings or friends, or be they our institutions like our teachers, the school, the society, the law, the politics, etc. We are always interdependent. We are dependent on the presence and work and care of other persons. So in that sense, you know, a Kantian approach to autonomy will not do. It will not really speak to our experience. And if we then move to the political level, that is certainly true when it comes to being an autonomous nation or autonomous state. We know very well, particularly from the experience of small nations like Norway and Timor Leste, that being a nation in the world, being a political community in the world, is always dependent on the presence and collaboration with others, other nations, other states, other institutions, global institutions. So we need a concept of autonomy that moves beyond this self-centeredness without undermining the importance of being a self, being someone who believes in the experiences, the knowledge, and the energy and the forces that we bring to the table. So we need to have the best in self-determination, the best in autonomy, namely the fact of taking responsibility for our presence with and for the others, and combine that with the humility of knowing that we're always dependent on the presence and action of other peoples and communities. That is why I propose that relational autonomy is something that we should consider when we talk about politics as well. I mean, there is a turn in political philosophy today within many disciplines, from feminist thinking to phenomenological, philosophical thinking, to psychology and to theology, my own field, that really stresses that our experience, our presence, our being in the world, our ontology, if you like, is relational. We could call it a relational turn. It is not like we are present as an instance or an object or a subject even, and then we relate to others. It is rather that through our relating to others, we become ourselves. And that relational turn is important also to our reflection on autonomy. And if we talk, when we think about how our existence is embedded, socially embedded, we also see why vulnerability is a very important and multifaceted concept. Because everyone being dependent is always also vulnerable. Because we are dependent on the presence and care and goodwill and community of other peoples, we are also vulnerable to their actions. And we know that very well from our own personal experiences, but also as nations that are, again, particularly as small nations, but we know very well in the world today with the actual crisis that all nations, however big they may be or consider themselves to be, are actually very dependent on the whole global community. We see it from the COVID crisis, we see it in the terrible war against Ukraine today, that the interdependence of the world, and we see it of course in the climate crisis as well, the very interdependence shows how our lives are always embedded in vulnerability. It is based on vulnerability. And that's also why we should turn that concept again, because often our traditional or conventional understanding of vulnerability is that it is a problem. It is something that should be reduced, something that ideally should be eliminated. But let's pause to think about that. If you would close your eyes and see an invulnerable person in front of you, I suppose that none of us would like really to have communion, to be a friend of an invulnerable person. Because really, vulnerability is our openness towards the presence of the other. Vulnerability means the potential of being wounded, yes. And that is a negative reality, to be wounded. But the potentiality of being open to the presence and impact of the other is really also the platform for any good community, any friendship, any loving relationship, and any flourishing political community is not just necessarily vulnerable, but it is constitutionally vulnerable, meaning that in order for it to be a good life or a good community, it needs to be vulnerable. So when we see it this way, we see that vulnerability is in fact not a problem to be eliminated, but a condition for the good life that should be protected. As such, we should not aspire for a life without vulnerability. We should aspire for good lives as vulnerable human beings in communion with each other. And these two ways of rephrasing the concept of autonomy to something which needs the presence of the other, a relational autonomy, and vulnerability as something that is not a regrettable fact of life, but is something to be nourished and something to be protected and something to be respected in every human being, and as something that we share. Both these reconsiderations are something that I propose that we also revisit today from the perspective of the Timorese experience in history and today. Because the Timorese experience, as you know much better than me, is an experience of much suffering, much pain, decades, generations of oppression, marginalization, domination, and death. But simultaneously, all the way, it is a history of dignity, of resistance, of resilience throughout the generations in the most unspeakable situations. Think about the Santa Cruz massacre, but also the decades of so much unknown suffering, so many silent voices from history, being in some sense present in this room as well, as we celebrate 20 years of autonomy for Timor Leste. Because it's a history of coming out of struggling against injustice, struggling to become autonomous in a sense related to the presence of the others. This is where we can talk about the resources. What kind of resources do we have, do we need, and what kind of resources do we have to really revisit the conventional concepts of autonomy and vulnerability, to make them much more rich and operational and valuable for our situation? Yes, I think we have the historical experience of Timor Leste as one resource. It should never be forgotten. It should be remembered with pride and with lament. But it forms part of that experience that says autonomy can never be only pure self-centeredness. It will always have to take into account the presence, the vulnerability, the suffering of the others as part of my own being in the world, as part of our way of building a different kind of nation. And I think that that resource from history will find necessarily different also religious and traditional ways of being kept alive, being remembered. I have been working with, and I've been very much learning from and inspired by Latin American traditions, Latin American theologies, Latin American struggles, very much like the East Timorese situation. I just 2 weeks ago came from El Salvador in Central America, living through once again very tough times with a lot of violence, gang violence, but also punitive populism that cracks down on anything in the name of a state of emergency that really absolves all the rights of all people, not just those who have committed crimes. So it's a difficult situation. And as you know, El Salvador also came out of a long history of authoritarian rule, of domination, oppression, which really made some theologians and Christian-based communities reflect upon the history of El Salvador in light of the Christian narratives and stories and faith traditions of crucifixion and resurrection. The Jesuit, the martyred Jesuit in 1809, Ignacio Ellacuría, and his colleague and friend Jon Sobrino, another Jesuit who's still alive, and of course their collaboration with the great Archbishop Romero, their reflection on the crucified people was an innovation in the history of theology, because what they did was to reflect upon a present historical experience, political experience of suffering, of injustice, of struggle, directly in light of the narrative and faith of Christ crucified. And saying that in our time we interpret Christ crucified through the experiences of our people being crucified each day, being tortured, being disappeared, being in marginalization and poverty. And on the other hand, we find that the narratives and the faith in this Christ crucified sheds light and inspires, gives this social imaginary, gives this background belief in our present struggles to renew it and to inform it in new ways in political saying. Now, the important thing to remember is that that way of speaking of crucifixion and suffering today is not a way of victimizing history. It is a way of taking the perspective of victims of history, and not only of the victors of history, but taking that perspective in order to give dignity and agency to people who are generally not given that privilege of being seen as agents. And that is very close to the core of the thinking about the crucified people, not as something fatalistic or passivism, but as an active recognition of the presence of something very dear, something even holy, in midst of the turbulence, in midst of the oppression, in midst of the suffering. There can emerge forces of good, forces of justice, forces of flourishing life. And perhaps you can see that from that theological reflection, we can come back to the way in which we can reformulate political autonomy in today's world. Political autonomy needs to emerge from such experiences of vulnerability, seeing vulnerability not only or not conventionally as a problem, but even as a value, as a strength, as something that leads to a different kind of political community today. So that is my reflection with you this morning, and my encouragement that the Timorese experience of 20 years of autonomy, but before that of decades and generations of struggle and of suffering, lead you to have confidence in contributing in your own country and beyond to a different concept of political autonomy and political community. So I'm looking forward to your own reflections and questions about this, and thank you for your attention.
Colleagues, before we continue on, allow me to acknowledge the presence of those of all of you here today. We have this live coverage on TV Education, Televisão Educação. We also have it live on Facebook, social media platforms. So here we have, we are privileged to have the presence of the EU Ambassador to Timor Leste, representative from the Malaysian Embassy, the head of the UN, the UNRC, UN Resident Coordinator, Mr. Roy Trivedi, representative or heads of UN agencies, the UNDP, of the WFP, so Madame Tuir, Mr. Dageng, and representatives from religious organizations, from the Catholic Church. We have representatives here from the diocese, from the National University, from some other private universities as well. The Catholic University representative is here. We have representatives from other religious groups here, representatives from our Timor Leste Muslim community is here, and Protestant community is also well represented here. And we have the president of the Timorese Concelho Ministros. He's here with us, so the media council, press council, sorry, not media, apology, press council. And we have DGs, we have advisors, we have intellectuals, we have thinkers, we have leaders, present leaders, we have future leaders that are all here well represented today. So that's this is the audience that we have before us. I had to say this because of the media, so they know that we are all here well represented for this occasion. Now, colleagues, before we move further, allow me to make some small changes. I think if we were to stop now, or pause now, after such a remarkable presentation from Professor Starla, then we will probably miss the momentum. So if you do not mind, I would like to invite Bishop Gunnar to deliver his remarks. Then we have this, then we continue afterwards with Q&A, then we go for coffee, where we will have a much more relaxed ambience for informal conversations. Just for those of you who do not know, Professor Starla is also a visiting fellow at Georgetown University. Georgetown is the oldest Catholic university in the US. It's a Jesuit institution, regarded very highly in the US. So he just delivered his remarks there, and then he went to El Salvador, and now he's here. We are very honored to have him here in Dili, Timor Leste. With that, I would like to invite Bishop Gunnar Stalsett to deliver his remarks. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. It is a great joy to be here. In many ways, it is a gathering of family and friendship. Family, obvious. My son is here with me. I also bring you greetings from my daughter, who is a professor of psychology and who has been here with the Chega Center to address the issue of trauma for victims. I could not be joined by both for this occasion because one has to stay home with the mother. But it's wonderful to be here, I must say. And when I was invited by His Excellency Minister Fidelis, my good friend and brother, I said, let Starla give the lecture and I will give some remarks. Because remarks are freer to, you know, go about what you remember, recall from the past, or comment on the present. I am getting older. My physical balance is not as good as it used to be. When I started my program here as Special Envoy of Norway to East Timor in 2006, I traveled here 10 times a year in the first period. I was fresh and clear when I arrived at 2 o'clock, and we started usually our first meetings at 5. And then during the 1 week I would stay here every time. I would meet with all of you, your predecessors who are in the different international institutions, the embassies, the NGOs, all those who have been embracing the history and the people of Timor-Leste. But more importantly, I had the privilege to be working very closely with the leaders of all the national institutions, the government, the legal dimension, the army. Every government office would be open for a dialogue on those topics which were on the agenda at that time. And I would say even perhaps more importantly than that, with civil society. To me, civil society is embracing the energy of the people as it develops itself in various organizations and directions and compositions. We often in peace processes relate to the institutions, and that is important. National institutions, international institutions, national authorities, international authorities. But the most fundamental sort of relationship is on the grassroots levels, with the resources which are there, with the resilience which Starla mentioned, with the memories and with the dreams. As I was listening, I thought it is a good illustration of the importance of shift in generations. That my son is speaking from his academic and existential and professional understanding in his generation. I am 87, so I am born before the World War II, and that is part of my memory. As a 5-year-old child, I have that picture of my mother bringing me and my brothers into the sitting room, and she said, "Look here, children, we are putting warm socks and gloves into this rucksack, and we will send it to our Finnish brothers and sisters who are fighting a war of freedom." My ancient roots are from Finland, so I have that minority antenna with me in Norway, 3 generations. Ethnic Finnish grandfather. My mother and father would speak Finnish when they didn't want our children to understand what they were up to. But it gave me that antenna of understanding what war and suffering is about, but also of that helping hand of a mother who sees the soldier and those who suffer in nations around us. I bring that with me. I bring that with me. So there is a personal context which is in itself a remark, a comment, that family and memory and localization define us, who we are and what we do, what our values are. I very often speak on the topic of the value of values. The value of values. I worked in Geneva for 10 years. I had meetings like this in restaurants or places. In one hotel lobby, there was this sign in not quite exact English, but it read, "Please leave your values at the front desk." It was a misunderstanding of values and valuables. You can leave your valuables, even sacrifice your valuables, share your valuables. But if you want to be that genuine person who makes a difference even in your own life and in the life of your family and your nation, you should not leave your values at the front desk. You should bring them into the room where decisions are made. And with that, I'm referring to another dimension that is so central also in the history of Timor Leste. Where are the values derived from? You have a history of colonization, yes, but you have also a history of spiritual identity which is diverse and which is with you even through the post-colonial period, where the presence of the Roman Catholic Church has imprinted values which are shared by Christians around the world and which are making its impact on the questions of solidarity, of the humanitarian challenges, of multiculturalism. One of my platforms has been Religions for Peace, where we work together, Buddhists, Hindu, Muslims, Jewish, Christians, under the motto, different faiths, common action. And why is it possible to do so? Because we recognize in each other the fundamental values. The fundamental values. When you come close, sometimes we differ on specifics. But at the bottom line is this: love God and your neighbor as yourself. I like always to say, let's start with the self, because that's often forgotten when we speak in sermons and in highfalutin language. But if you don't have that self-respect, if you don't have that pride of your identity, whoever you are, yes, if you don't have that reasonable love of yourself, you may not be able to love the other. The relationship of face-to-face, the ethics of face-to-face, is based on that mutual recognition of equal dignity. So these are the values. We traveled from Oslo on the 16th of May. It took us about 50 hours this time to come here, the longest ever. But that meant that we had one important day in an airport in Kuala Lumpur, the 17th of May, which is the National Day of Norway. And I was thinking, yes, in this century, national days are often celebrated in transit. And we are in transit to an important event in this country, the National Day of the 20th of May. And this year we'll even celebrate the 20th anniversary of a youth coming of age. And we are celebrating the inauguration of President Jose Ramos Horta. So it is really, as I was reflecting in that airport and as we were traveling on this journey, almost journey through history. The National Day in Norway, and I'll give you a little glimpse of that, is the Children's Day. There is no march of armies. There is no show of force. It is the children who parade in every city, in every village, how small it is. This year, after 2 years pandemic, which has made it impossible to do that, it was the greatest parade ever in Oslo with 120,000 children marching past the palace and greeting the royal family. But before they came to the palace, they greeted the president of the parliament, who is a Muslim, who is an immigrant from Iran, who came to Norway with his parents when he was 5 years old. And last year, he was elected to the second highest level of authority in our country after the king. So they passed by these two, not hailing them, not praising them, but recognizing that in this celebration of a national identity, we are in generational relationship. We are a multi-ethnic country in a new century. There was a poet and activist, and that's wonderful when they is joined in one person, Henrik Wergeland. I'm sure you have never heard of him because he was there in 1814 when we got our constitution. He helped us to understand that when we speak about national identity and when we celebrate national identity, it is a celebration of empathy, of tolerance. It is a celebration where the narratives, the collective narratives, what we share together, but also the personal individual narratives matter. Because if there were not the personal and individual narratives of yourself, there would not be a national narrative. And Wergeland has a few very great statements that we remember in our history even today. He says, every religion has a loving heart. That was his point of departure. Every religion has a loving heart. And that had something almost radical when he said that, sort of in the 1820s, 30s. Today we know that that is the only way forward, that we are able to recognize in the other faith a loving heart. Dalai Lama once said to me, he asked me, he said, over his spectacles like this, he said, Gunnar, what is the most precious for you in my religion? He said, and I was surprised. How could I say what is most precious for me in the Buddhist religion? But I was able to say that. An element which is so important today, that of caring for the whole created world as one dimension. And then I thought afterwards, and I said, when we had finished that part of the dialogue, and I said, Your Holiness, what is the most precious for you in my religion? And then he said, that you believe in a God who knows you, who loves you, who has died for you, and who is with you. That is the most precious for me in your religion. So the loving heart. But he also said, Wergeland, he raised the question, can goodness, beauty, can that thrive, can that flourish in chains? Yes, it can. It can. Your history has shown that. But to flourish the full experience of goodness and beauty, you need freedom. And that is why the struggle for freedom has been so essential, even not only for the national story that we celebrate on the 20th, but for everyone. And Wergeland said, love of one's country is the mother of great virtues. Love of one's country is the mother of great virtues. And as I revisited that quote, I thought of the Ukraine. I thought of the war of Russia against Ukraine today. And the love of your country has to be mobilized against the hatred against your country, as we see in that dramatic situation. Love of one's country is the mother of the great virtues. Now, with this as background, let me be very concrete. I first encountered Timor Leste in 1975 at the General Assembly of the World Council of Churches in Nairobi. In December, just at the time when we reached the news about an invasion and taking over of Timor Leste. And we made a statement from the World Council of Churches, which gathers all the churches except the Catholic Church. They are not joined there, but they are with us in spirit. We made a statement for the freedom of the Timorese people, for the protection of the Timorese people. And then I continued to be engaged. Then in 1996, as a member of the Nobel Peace Prize Committee, I argued for the Peace Prize to recognize the people of East Timor. And how would we do that? We always have to put names. So we agreed on Horta and Vero. And again, you see the dimensions, these two dimensions, that spiritual identity and reality, and diplomatic, political work that has to be done on the basis of the same values. And I must say, I have been on the committee for 17 years. The Peace Prize to East Timor via Horta and Vero is, in my book, the most important because it contributed to the change of the history of one people and one country. And you should revisit that when you have time to see what these two leaders of the nation had to share on the international platform about the past and the future. I bring that with me in my memory, but also in my own understanding of what the struggle is about when we will celebrate the 20th anniversary of the freedom of these people of East Timor. Together with the leaders of this nation, the crisis in 2006 after independence brought me to this country as special envoy of Norway with the task to try to bring about understanding and cooperation on the highest level, because that relationship had broken down. And in the first encounter we had in Hotel Timor, the conclusion of that encounter was that the leaders of this nation would sit together and begin to talk together. Following that breakthrough, we celebrated the 10th of December outside the Parliament building, and we honored the traditions of the past with the spiritual heritage, but also the present. And I think that that was also significant. Then the first meeting that we organized was Justice for the Poor, Time to Deliver. Justice for the Poor, Time to Deliver. That was, in my view, the best way to approach the common agenda of the people, which should be the agenda of your leaders. The next conference was Youth, Identity and Peace. And we brought 300 persons, young people, together to the first international youth gathering in Timor Leste. 100 young people from around the world were with us through that important gathering. And I think that's where I, the first time, really sensed the leadership of my brother Fidelis. The next consultation we had was Women and Peace. And I must say that every time I share a reflection on equality, I remember the role of women in the struggle for peace and independence and human dignity in Timor-Leste, the suffering of the women, but also the women as participants in the struggle, concretely so, and holding the families together, living the memory, and praying and hoping for the good future. And I know the women of East Timor are continuing to remind the authorities of the challenges which still are before you. I was mentioning the gathering on the 10th of December in 2006 outside the Parliament. And there the motto was finding a path to peace. Surumutu Badame. And I think that this formulation shows that it is in a way a never-ending work. We are at the chapter, a turning point, as we all know, in history, globally. We sense it in every part of the world. I'm very much involved in the peace process in Myanmar, and I've been involved in other conflicts and continents. But at this time in history, I feel that we are at points of great challenge, great pain, but also with ways, new ways. And brothers and sisters, Excellencies, as a person of religion, of faith, I'm also a citizen, and I have had political leadership at one chapter in my life. But and particularly the age at which I am now, I feel it is important to communicate the soft power of shared human values and the soft power of religion. Religion could be outdated. We could speak about religion for better and worse when religion is turned around against itself and against others. But religion is here to stay with us in different forms, and it is that soft power that we shouldn't be shy about bringing into the political dialogue. Why is it a soft power, or when is it a soft power? When it breathes humanity. It thrives by true spirituality. It lives on the ethics of care, the moral of care, and it is actually fundamentally rooted in values and virtues. So I close here by saying to you, we are of the same heartbeat of faith, hope, and love. Faith, hope, and love. What more can we muster for world peace? I love that sentence from the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are you peacemakers. God will call you his children. That is the most generous statement I know, because there is no if. If you have the right formulations, if you have the right status, if you have the right place in society, no. Blessed are the peacemakers, whoever you are. And the generous God will call you his children. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bishop Gunnar. Colega Sira, antes de continuar, we also have the representatives from civil society organizations. They're all here, Bishop. So representatives from civil society organizations are all here represented. So we have national, international NGOs and non-NGO civil societies. For example, the representative from Oxfam International, the country rep, is here, and some other civil society organizations are also here represented. Okay, Maluk Sira, colega Sira, excelências, iteronona, ohin tanto intervenção Husi, professor Starla, no Bispo Emeritu Gunnar Stalsett. Husi intervenção no bema que professor Starla halo, ni focus liu ba Iha a questão de autonomia e tinha no importância Husi vulnerabilidade. Então, vulnerabilidade é contexto da nécada que a essência humana, a vulnerabilidade lá hoje é nesse instrumento para autovitimização, para vitimizar, mas bem mostra nessa fonte de força. Para itabele cria, inspira para o mundo de neve perfeito, dia-clio, não perfeito, dia-clio, e neve justiça para o mundo. E rolamos referência balo, para simbologia cristã Nian, para instrumentos religiosos sira inclui halo referência para Iha movimento sira, neve marca sombrino no associado sira para Bispo Romero halo usa simbologia cristã, sacrifício, de prega e cruz, nessa motivação instrumento ira para renascença, para moricias filafale, de bela luta, e a perseverança, soro desafio ser moris nem no lore justiça para ser na bem maca vulnerável e moris. Então ainda ponto essencial se professor Stalsett Nian. Ponto ida chave moço intervenção ainda cada ser humano e tem a noção rua ida maca tuir tradição Santo Agostinho Nian, que vitas terrena, no que vitas dei katak mores e mundo, no mores e lalehan. Agora, atu inspira o mehi atu hetan cidadão ou atu hetan pertence vai ela lalehan deit, lá to se carga la halo, botutu nebe diak, esforço tomak para mundo, né, sai diak liu e justo liu ba maluk ser seluk, ou cidadão ser outro mundo nian. Intervenção do Bispo Gunnar Stalsett, colhia ponto essencial da minha forma que é importante ter a tua Iha diálogo intergeracional. Valores ser na beita lori hetenean, pode bem que ita herda Husi, pode bem que ita aprende Husi gerações sira nebe mais antes ita. Então, forma ser o que te deixa katak para ser cidadão mundunian, importante ter a tua noção de identidade de ita nem mais nebe, valores, raízes sira nebe makita lori, Husi teninian, uma laran rasik, não ita nem sociedade rasik. Então é possível, exemplo de ser, to be a good citizen of the international community, but at the same time to be a very good citizen of Timor Leste. So we can really promote the best that the society has in order to become a responsible global citizen. O Bispo Gunnar Stalsett mos halo referência para quando o processo ser inclui niyo hintemi kata que no 1996 mohira niya nessa membro do Comitê Nobel da Paz se atribui prêmio Nobel para povo timoruan, nebe representa a altura na ba Husi líderes timoruan na rua, presidente eleito Dr. José Ramos Horta, no Bispo Emeritu Timor Nian, Dom Carlos Felipe Ximenes Belo. Tuir Bispo Gunnar Stalsett, niya no encatak ia niya livro rasik, niya record rasik, decisão ida nebe niya considera nessa decisão de dia que tebes no referência bot ba humanidade maka decisão ba Timor. Ida mos maka decisão ba Timor. Tamba ho decisão ida ne pode atribui prêmio ba líder Timor wan na rua muda bele contribui hodi muda destino tomak povo ida nian maka povo Timor Leste nian. Então, hirak nem maka nessa informação tanto pode mesmo agora partilha o pode ser ponto essencial balo. Husi intervenção hirak nem maka Bispo Gunnar halo no professor Starla halo para bele facilita e tinha malu que ser na bem maka lá mai e a evento ida nem na bem acompanha o mídia social sira por não ser mos bele pelo menos e noção conaba hirak na bem maka infeliz hirak na bem maka lá consegue acompanhar o completa o inglês bele e referências badak sinopse badak Husi intervenção sira na bem maka ohin sira rua halo. Então excelência sira ba participante sira roto nessa não é o tema, o objetivo Husi intervenção de né, mas é caráter mais espiritual, mas é intelectual. Então, o de né é o cara que loque discussão, vai te pode ser, favorita terminaram, e minha cara que dirige pergunta para você, ba professor Starla cá, ba Bispo Gunnar. Livremente, pelo Husi pergunta, tanto pela relaciona direta com a intervenção será hoje, cá assunto global ser seluk maka imi dalla ruma Iha pergunta karek agora nessa hau para nessa atu halo umalaran halo ambiente mamarliu Bispo Gunnar ema barak dehan nia bela tau hini CV de nia candidato Nobel da Paz ne loskalai just to lighten the conversation. There are people, especially celebrities, say that they put on their CV that they've been nominated for Nobel Peace Prize. If that's the common practice, or you don't really know who nominate for Nobel Prize, and it is something secret and confidential, please.
Yes, it is a very important
rule of the committee never to say who is nominated. Usually around 200 are nominated every year. Some 150 individuals and 50 organizations. From my experience, I would say that about 50 of these 200 are realistic nominations. Many are nominated for the prestige of being able to say he or she was nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize. The only knowledge that is outside the committee about who has been nominated is when those who nominate the person say, we have nominated that person and that person. So there are those who use it in sort of a promotion of a person to say, we have nominated that person for the Peace Prize. Let me just say that the official statement gives the reason of the committee, not anything of the discussion, not whether it was unanimous. There are only 5 members in the committee, only 5 members, and we serve for periods of 5 years, which are renewable. So it is a very strong process of reflection and secrecy in a way. And usually the committee does not go out afterwards to give statements whether they are happy with the reaction or not. Sometimes, obviously, the decision has not been so well taken, and there are glaring exceptions. Gandhi never got the prize, Václav Havel didn't get the prize, and there are many in history who should have had the prize. And there are some who got the prize who never should have had it. But there has never been raised a question about the two in 96. I have a question. Why didn't we include Shanana at that time? But the thinking, as I understand it, generally from the time, was the humanitarian understanding, the peace making, non-military, peaceful action, and so on. So the committee, if I say it in general terms, had probably not come to the point where one recognized people who have had to lead liberation struggles. My own inclination now is to say that also people who have been the leader of liberation struggles should be considered into that mandate of the Peace Committee, of the Peace Prize. The understanding of peace has developed. The latest demonstration of what peace is about is the fact that the climate issue is being seen as part of the understanding of world peace. Humanitarian actions, diplomacy, human rights, holding of peace conventions, and so on and so forth. So it is an evolving concept of peace, and I think an evolving understanding in the committee what peace is about and who could be honored.
Thank you. Obrigado. A pergunta hoje é pergunta camânida do Rahu. Pois não quer dizer que está boa ser a pergunta altamente intelectual. How me permite a união de a pergunta ser assim. Mas antes eu vou ita Rahu sulai professor Starla. How do you reconcile between the person and the society? What if the society's values are off? Are not? Are denigrating? Are violent? How do you, what is your
Thank you. That is a very interesting and complex issue, because I was saying that we often go from the level of interpersonal and personal experiences and deliberations, and we elevate that to the level of society and politics. But it's quite clear that it's not necessarily a unidirectional or an easy analogy between the two levels. Sometimes society can be immoral, whereas not necessarily people in that society. They can be living their virtues, but nonetheless there is a violent or an oppressive framework that is at the societal level. There was one important book written in 1930, or at least published in 1932 by a North American theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr, which the title was quite informative. It says, "Moral Man, Immoral Society." That there is not necessarily, it is not necessarily that what is moral to the person can be directly transmitted to what is moral on the societal level. But what we often see, and that's my counter argument, what we often see is that politicians and states make exceptions for themselves under some sort of referral to necessity, to emergency. And then they can excuse all kinds of immoralities in the name of some sort of realistic or high politics. I think we should be wary of that. I think it's important to insist that what we experience as important personal virtues and values should also come to expression at the level of politics and society. That it is relevant, the intimate and the personal experience of what counts, what is valuable in my life, should also be transmitted and transferred to the political level. And that's, as you were rightly pointing out, that's on the level of personal leadership. We know that that is important, that leaders carry on their deliberations and their actions based on virtues and on personal commitments. But it's also important at the level of what I call the social imaginary, the background towards which we interpret our political actions and agency. That actually these basic values of justice, truth, love are political concepts as well as personal concepts.
Thank you.
So my name is Isaías Avilio Caldas, and I'm a Jesuit priest. Currently work as the director of our junior and senior high school called Colégio de Santo Inácio Loyola in Kasait. I would like, at the beginning of my question, I would like to appreciate you, Professor Starla, for your input, especially the new insight on autonomy and vulnerability. You criticized Immanuel Kant, and then you, because we are totally interconnected and interdependent. And then what I like most about your definition of vulnerability being this capacity to be open to others, because our being in the world is socially embedded, as you said. And that brought me to think of Levinas, the face of the other. But my question is that we are this new understanding, and this is the fact that we are all interconnected, and that therefore we have to revisit our concept of national autonomy. But I'd like to maybe not, who am I to say problematize, but I think if I'm open in my vulnerability so that I can be open to the others, there is, I think, danger here, because if I'm vulnerable, I'm open, I can be exploited. So I think in your intervention, maybe you forgot to touch on the concept of equality, because if I'm open in my vulnerability so that the others, we can collaborate, but if the other come with paternalistic attitude, how is that? And that leads me to question or to connect to national identity. As a new country, we are quite vulnerable. We need many things from our partners. But then I think, my question is, we should give ourselves some time to prepare, to develop this self-pride in order to accept help. Otherwise, we are swallowed by this multinational help that we are receiving. And as a consequence, we can forget, we can lose our national identity. So, what are your comments about this? Thank you very much.
Obrigado. Hello. Okay. Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here to listen to both of you, Bishop Gunnar and Professor Stalsett. I will start my question by presenting what my spiritual observation about our country. As Bishop Gunnar mentioned, that a name of a poet in those times. And I think in our country we need poet, at least not as great as the Greek Homer or the Roman Virgil, but someone that can help us to write an epic about our struggle, so that epic could become a collective narrative of our people. Because 20 years of restoration, it's a sum of the years needed by the great hero of Greek, Ulysses. So the 10 years to win the battle against the Trojans, and the 10 years to return to his country. But we, Timorese, we need 24 years to go. And now we are in the middle of 23, so one more year to complete that. And I think we are still in that island where Ulysses was trapped in Calypso, waiting to be seduced by that nymph, beautiful nymph, to get married. The question to Professor Stalsett, you mentioned about Plato's concept of the isotimia, the need to feel equal to others. But now with this era, when we are also part, we are in that concept, new concept described by Fukuyama, the megalothymia, the need to be recognized as superior, the compulsion of be superior, or the ambition, the tyrannical ambition, not just here but in the past. So when we talk about autonomy, I think that was the struggle between the being isotomic or being megalothymia. So how we can, what kind of measures, what kind of spiritual thing we need to do to come to that, the autonomy that based on the sense of isotomy, that the need to be equal to others. To Bishop Gunnar, these 20 years, for me, what come to my reflections is that we forgot, we failed to interpret what the evangelist Luke say in his evangelic Luke 15 about the prodigal son. So we forgot to do that, and we tend to violate what Paul say in his words to the Corinthians one about the free choice. That I'm free to do everything, but not everything is beneficial to us. And here we tend to, because we have done everything for this country, we tend to do everything, even include those not beneficial to us. So I want to, I just want to have some advice for us, because we just don't want to be proud of being, Catholic 98%, but we still not understand what the prodigal son means for us. Thank you.
I am told that I have. Thank you, Minister. It is really a privilege to be invited to this event. I don't know if I do have a question, but Professor Stalsett, your remarks, your presentation really stirred up a lot of thoughts in my head, especially as it concerns power relations in our country. I didn't really intend to raise this raise this question, but Father Elias, your question really provoked me. For some of us, the notion of dependence is, I think, more emphatically realized than it is for others. And then in the end, it exposed quite, I think, the majority of the members of this society to exploitation. So I think it would be beneficial, or probably stir up more thoughts in my head, if you could touch a little bit on how these power relations changes in your experience, or I don't know, from the theological, theological point of view, in order to maintain this kind of interdependency and fruitful autonomy within our society. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Excellent questions, excellent challenges for reflection. Thank you. Risky. You're quite right. There is a very important we need to remember exploitation as the very real experience of vulnerability, of exposed vulnerability,
both at the personal level and at the political national level. So the danger about speaking differently about vulnerability is, of course, that it can sound as if it's a harmonization or idealization of the fact of being misused or exploited by others. It should never be. And that gives me the opportunity of distinguishing between what we could call ontological or anthropological vulnerability and situational vulnerability. The ontological, anthropological vulnerability is the shared vulnerability of all. There is no living organism, no living human being, no living environment that is not, who is not vulnerable. And the very fact of being vulnerable is decisive for that life to continue, right? To be receiving from others, to be dependent on others. That is a basis for possible solidarity, for possible good life in community and flourishing personal life. But we all know, and that's why the question about equality is so important. We all know that although we share this basic anthropological or even ontological vulnerability, the way in which our vulnerability is respected is very much unevenly distributed. And that's the situational vulnerability. We are never vulnerable in the same way or in the same degree. And there is a very clear unjust distribution of situational vulnerability in the world today, as we all are aware of. And that is where it is important to underline that equality that emerges from the common shared life as vulnerable is necessarily also a question for justice. Always. Justice is not a principle but a relation, and it applies to each in asymmetrical ways, because we are all in asymmetrical relationships of vulnerability. I am dependent upon my father. He is dependent on me in different ways. Our relationship is one of vulnerability to each other, but very much asymmetrical. And that's the way all our relationships are constituted. And that takes me to the very good question about recognition and identity and the concept of isothemia or megalothemia. I really know these concepts are made relevant in today's today's discussion, as you very well pointed out, by Francis Fukuyama's quite recent book on identity politics, in which he criticizes the kind of identity politics that is based on an idea of megalothemia, of me being recognized as greater, as superior to you, right? But the identity politics of me or our group or our people being recognized as of equal dignity and value as you is a very important identity politics, and should never be, the two should never be confused. And that's why particularly small nations, small peoples who have been marginalized, who have been dominated, who come from colonized histories, should never cease to be proud and to demand to be recognized as equal in dignity, at the same time of being distinct, being different. Equality is never the same as similarity. It is not by being similar to you that we should respect each other, but being equal in respecting the difference.
as something is isothymia. I demand thymia to be recognized as equal, iso, not megalo, not greater than. So I think that distinction is very helpful and important in our reflections also on this. And that takes me also to your comment, which I think is also very much important, that it's about our relationship as needing to be self-affirmative, as also Gunnar was saying. It's very much in today's political philosophy discussions on the relationship between, I was talking about the relational autonomy, but there is a very recent book out now also putting together relational autonomy and relational equality. And the two concepts belong to each other and they challenge each other. And I think in order for one who has been considered unequal or less dignified, oppressed or dominated, it is necessary to take time and effort to love oneself, to aspire to be proud of one's own history, and to protect one's own resources before being, so to speak, out in the common room to share with all. Because it's not given in the political world that you will be respected as vulnerable. There will always be those who will try to exploit vulnerability, but they themselves are vulnerable, whether they recognize it or not. And that is our possibility of rephrasing our community in a different way. Thank you.
Well, excuse me. I don't have much wisdom to add to these last comments, but let me add a few things about this concern that you need your identity as a nation before you enter onto the platform of the multinational, multicultural Malmstream. If you think about the 20 years since you had your constitution, your independence, your national identity, that was not the beginning of your history as a people. That was a new chapter where your identity was being developed further. Not that it was underdeveloped before, but it was added to that identity, making it stronger, make it more a self. In a way, 20 years, that is what many persons of 20-year experience today. My grandchildren are around 20 and 30 years, and I think that they are in that struggle of identity, being sure of themselves before they are on the platform of a society, culturally, socially, politically, economically, and everything. This also refers to the question about the prodigal son who reached that great heritage and just spoiled it. He was after what is good for me, what is good for me. But the interesting formulations in that story are twofold to me to understand the concern here. He came to himself is an expression. He found himself. But in finding himself, he found the father and the mother. I add that with the mother. But he found it was not only memory, but it was history for him. It was identity. And he recaptured that identity, and he enriched his life by embracing the past and being embraced by his father as the future. So as a paradigm, as a narrative, I think that that has very much to contribute today. If I take a minute to put this in my own experience from my relationship to Timor Leste, the national consensus dialogue on truth, justice, and reconciliation, where Fidelis was the man on the spot here. I gave some inspiration and direction from far away, and I came here to discuss with the authorities and with the NGO and with the churches, religious communities. The elements in that conversation was national, was consensus, was dialogue, and reconciliation. In many of my dialogues on that topic here, I was challenged by people, including Ramos Horta, who would say to me, yes, that is well and good, but what about forgiveness? Especially when we spoke about the legislation that led to the establishment of the Chega Center. And it is a good reminder that reconciliation needs truth, painful truth, justice, truth and justice in order to establish reconciliation. And the Chega Institute is the lasting result of that process over years, where we were in that national consensus dialogue where leaders on the highest level participated, government, parliament, judiciary, but also the NGOs, and we were advised by the diplomatic community. They were not part of it because I was convinced that this had to be owned by the Timorese themselves. I could facilitate, I could help to even finance that process, but it had to be owned. So the steering committee for that process was entirely represented by the Timorese realities of civil society, of church, of politicians, of people in authority. I use this as, and I had thought I would develop it more in my speech, but I sense that I had used enough time and I would come back to it in my comment. But it is important, I think, today, when we speak about identity, to be revisiting that dialogue, that process from 29 and 10, which resulted in legislation in Parliament, which resulted in the establishment of a lasting presence of Chega, not only on the shelves with the books, which is such a great contribution globally also, but in an institute that is given the mandate to protect the experience, even the trauma of the past, but to lead you to the future. This is the complexity, and I would also say the simplicity of identity.
Thank you very much we have almost 25 minutes. I know that our audience, our colleagues here are very busy with activities today. So we will church, former politician himself. So during our informal coffee session that will take place, you can feel free to ask and to have private conversation with Bishop Gunnar. Now, before I move on to another one or two, three hands here, but just allow me to ask Professor Starla this one last question. So, how when because you mentioned about the critique to the Kantian approach to peace, as well as peace is not essentially not internal, not purely for contemplation, but also revelation. So, to what extent, what is the danger of you becoming functional or utilitarian? So, what is the element of that, the power of perfection, and to what extent will you see or open the way for either emancipation or revolution? How do you see the drive for revolution with the language of vulnerability and emancipation, or striving for transport? What can be the examples, either negative or positive, theologically, in seeing social and political revolutions? And with that, this is the last question, just to summarize and put together some of the thinking processes. Now, I've seen hands here, so the Pontu-de-Vista, the Bispo, so we have three more questions. Come on, quick. One, two more, please. Roberto. Okay. Wow. Okay. I have to just stick to the point. To the point and just ask the question. It seems like I have to tolerate 2 or 3 more questions. And you know, I don't want to
Yeah, thank you very much. The host minister of Presidency of Council of Ministers. My name is Fausto Gama. I'm working for the Ministry of Presidential Council of Ministers. As you know that we have just stepped out from a conflict, the conflict that we had with our neighbor, and also the conflict that we had between us in the country. And we also know that the state, the leaders of this country have made efforts to create a social cohesion between the people, between the political parties, between the communities. But so far, the reconciliation efforts that made by our leaders, proposed by our leaders, and it's just at the level of political people, at the level of leaders. We had 5 big political parties before the independence, and the reconciliation had done between them and discussed about the past differences. But unfortunately, the reconciliation effort that done is just at the level of high level, but not going down to the root level, to the communal level. So what is your comments, or what is your suggestion, whether the leader should also bring this reconciliation effort down to the communal and make it a big reconciliation ceremony, reconcile people to people in the communities, because as you know that to differences. Some people support independence, some others support autonomy. Now, those people who support autonomy, their sons, their relatives also support independence. This issue has brought to, is still alive until today, because people are vulnerable to each other. So do you think that this reconciliation effort needs to be brought down to the communal level, and people talk to each other, accept each other, and think working together for the future? Thank you.
Thank you, Sr. Fausto. Depois vou para o Padre Jovito. Mas por favor, estamos a questão de tempo, tu depois vai diretamente a pergunta. Para depois, por favor, Sr. Padre.
Thank you. I'm Jovito, Catholic priest in the Diocese of Tilly. I'm here as a member of CNC, Administration Council. Professor, you talk about the law as the foundation of human relationship between autonomy and vulnerability. Is the global crisis of humanity is the consequence of wrongdoings which broke the laws, the supreme law, the law of God, divine law, the natural law, and human law as the frame of all relationship among human beings. And its autonomy itself is a law of the powerful people, and the vulnerability is the law for the vulnerable people. Thank you.
Senhora Madre, e depois Senhor Daguin.
Obrigada. So thank you. And then firstly, I would like to express my deep gratitude and thank you for your sharing from the father and son, to share with us as a friend of yourself. You are very welcome to Bishop Gunnar, because your presence makes a lot of sense in our life as Timorese. Firstly, I am Sister Guillermina Marsal, Canusian sister. My first address, I would like to express my deep gratitude to Professor for your experience of knowledge, and especially how to deal with theology and political issues around the world. And especially, while we're talking about theology and political issues, it's the meaning of political issues and theology need to change each other, or to be one way, to help ourselves to bring the values and the loving care of God among us. But simultaneously, while we're talking about the political issues and theology, sometimes rose up a lot of misunderstanding among ourselves as human beings. That is my question. For Bishop Gunnar, thank you. Because as usual, you also mentioned about the role of Timorese women during the struggle and during independence time, yesterday, today, and tomorrow. It means that when it our grounded for lack of feminine touch, I think something is lack there. Therefore, I appreciate your thought. It makes my heart brilliant to be a woman, to be a Timorese, and to be a religious woman in East Timor. Thank you.
Obrigado, Sr. Dragan. For Sr. Dragan. For Sr. Dragan.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you.
Dear close.
Please. Yeah. And again, Wolfram Bokwan. I'm so honored and to listen to your inspiration speech from father and son. And we are actually WP, where I'm so glad to see you put a SDG pin there. And also WP, actually I'm putting also a Nobel Peace Prize pin with us. Just such a coincidence. But I remember Minister was mentioning, hope you also, those Nobel Peace Laureate, you pick up all the good guys. I think we are very lucky and humble that you pick up WP in 2020 as a Nobel Peace Laureate as well. Last year, please, I think, Gunnar, WP, we organized with the Nobel Peace Center, Fix the Food, a kind of one-year journey for WP get a Nobel Peace Prize. We got many Nobel Peace Laureates sit together, how to fix the food in light of the food crisis, that even before the Ukraine crisis. So today we talk about autonomy. We also talk about food sovereignty, autonomy, food sovereignty. For Timor Leste, actually, as you know, I think we are so much food import dependent country. With those many years you've been visiting Timor Leste, I don't know what kind of advice to seek a good balance about food import and promotion of local production. I think that's a kind of fine balance in that. So thank you, sir, for your opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. Agora ita halo hotulai pergunta ida ne para telai. Ursida pergunta how nota kata que pergunta tolu igos liu. Mas ne ursida ba depois de hatan mak bafal pergunta no dita taka. Nega, senhor Sera. So we ne how for Bishop Gunnar, please go ahead with the answers, then I'll give to Starla.
Thank you. The question of national reconciliation must always be there with us and be taken seriously. The model that we developed here under the leadership also of Minister Fidelis, which I referred to as national. Who are the ones who compose what is national? It is not only the political leaders, it is not only NGOs or the church or whatever movements. National is the concept of the whole nation. And of course, if reconciliation takes place on strata, on different levels without connection between these levels, you are not reaching the goal. When I was appointed special envoy to East Timor, it was upon an invitation from then Foreign Minister Horta, and the invitation was simply help us to talk together on the highest level in this country. So when I came here, I visited all the representatives of the institutions of the state. And those of you who recall the conflict in 2006, remember that it was a breakdown in relationship between the governing bodies, but basically not the bodies, but the personalities who did not talk together. And the first result we had of the first consultation was the promise of Shanana, we will talk together. We will talk together. And when we had, on the 10th of December, that ceremony outside the government palace, Shanana, as president, spoke to the people, and he asked for forgiveness because we have not been taking each other seriously. We have not developed that harmony which our people deserve. You should revisit the speech from that day. And in my comments on that ceremony, I simply repeated in summary what Velo and Horta had said when they received the Peace Prize. I did not bring a Norwegian voice. I simply repeated your own voice in that. That was that level. But I was enriched by the fantastic activity on NGO level. The women role, the women in the church, women in society, the combination between them, but also the various interest groups who were well organized and very much led by competent people. But there was this gap between, as you suggested, between agreement or disagreement on the top, willing to take each other seriously on the top, and what was happening on the ground. And before there is a convergence, coming together of grassroots and the top, there will not be real reconciliation. Democracy is actually defined not by the top, but by the demos, by the people. So you should never give up in your engagement for leadership and for the future of the nation. You should never give up the priority of the grassroots, because that is what democracy is. That's a building stone. And if there is a gap, or even perhaps a distrust between these levels in society, that should be clearly addressed. That is not creating enmity or adversity between the two levels, but it is that needed act of reconciliation, taking each other seriously. I'm very hopeful when I recall the activity from these processes here. I'm very optimistic about the next chapter, the next 20 years, with the new generation coming of age, with the nation coming of age. It is sort of the rule of life that the founding fathers and mothers, their period is coming to an end. The next generation will take over in due course. It will honor the achievements, but also learn from the mistakes and the faults. And this is not something disrespectful of the past. It is an honest situation, which we also know within the family, where you respect the grandparents and the parents, but where the young people have to charter their own way to the future. So that this shift now in the presidency, coming back to one of the most prominent figures in your history, Jose Ramos Horta, at the time when you as a nation celebrate 20 years, it is a gift of possibility, but it is not automatic. It needs to be embraced as a possibility to write a new chapter which builds on the past but is not a repetition of it. The food security issue illustrates the vulnerability. The war in Ukraine, or against Ukraine, has raised the question about food sufficiency in every country, even in Norway. There is a greater awareness of we are not producing the wheat we need for our own need. You have the same question about rice. We have oil and gas plenty. you have had oil and gas plenty, and you may have it still, but it needs to be considered for whatever development techniques should be used. But without the natural resources on the ground in agriculture, where you feed the family on the ground in the village where they are, you will be very much vulnerable for any shifts in relationship of economic character to your neighbor, but also globally. So what can be done in terms of securing what should I say, the farming future? Coming from a fish nation like Norway, I discussed from the very first evening I was here, as I was enjoying a wonderful fish meal, you are an island nation. Have you explored to the fullest possible what is still there in the seas for you? And as we move forward now, what is in the seas is not only the fish. There are also other creatures and plants. The sea is not a dead part of the cosmos. It is very much alive. So maybe East Timor could do more to look back into the possibility of being also not only a farming nation with the resources you have, but also one which develops the ocean as a resource for food and for sustainability. So that is a sort of practical layman's view of these things. Actually, in my former life, when I was head of a political party in Norway for a period of 2 years in the 70s, before I went back to full church work, I was a chairman of the Farmers' Party. So that dimension is very close to my heart.
Thank you, Professor Starla.
Thank you. So many good interventions. I hope we can be in contact in various ways afterwards, because time will not permit me to answer in full to all of these and hear more from you. But let me have just a few points. We heard in the first round of interventions that we need poets. Maybe you know the great late singer Leonard Cohen of Jewish background. His line that is, "There's a crack in everything. That's how light gets in." I think vulnerability reminds us of the fact that we all know, but that we need to be reminded of, that nothing is perfect. Our world is not perfect. Our lives will never be perfect. And I think, Fidelis, although I don't speak Techem, I think you were referring to the Augustinian concept of the heavenly city and the earthly city. And of course, politics is always part of the political or of the earthly city, in which there is conflict, there is imperfection, there is injustice, and we have to deal with that. We have to stand up to that. And I think hearing about, once again, being reminded of the very real conflicts and the real costs that conflicts have. I was reminded of when my father, now he's now 87, as you know, although people keep asking him if I am his brother. So, we celebrated his 80th year with a seminar with the title, "The Necessity of Conflict and the Cost of Reconciliation." And you know, it's often the opposite, the necessity of reconciliation and the cost of conflict, which is obvious. But there is also a moment of recognizing the necessity of conflict, of standing up against injustice and violence and self-interest that denigrates other people. And that's the story of Timor Leste and so many peoples and groups in this world. So your question about change, about evolution, about revolution, about justice, I think vulnerability is part of that remindfulness of the need for change, for continuous change, that the world is imperfect, and that's the way we have to live it. And there are moments of necessary opposition and conflict, and there's a cost that we need to pay for reconciliation, which is also necessary. So that's I think is very important to remember in this. And thank you for bringing up, sister, the very important role of women's struggles. I would say that the issue about vulnerability as a strength, as resisting, is very much the story of how women have liberated themselves from oppression all over the world, as well as indigenous people. In many ways, their struggle have not been by force, but by staying together, sharing vulnerability, but resisting in that, and reminding that life is beyond force and ambition to be best. So thank you for that, and let's just continue to be inspired by each other, and to let religious convictions and theology inspire politics, and political action always concretize our values. Religion should never dictate politics. Politics should never dictate religion, but they never come separated. They always come together, and it's our role, being autonomous and vulnerable at the same time, to distinguish well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hoje how ite pergunta tolu ikusliu, mas favorida body ritme pergunta também. We only have maximum 15 minutes left. Maximum 15. So please just go directly to the questions. Please avoid commentaries. So Fausto and Nino, so hand, and one there, and Sr. Gutriano, Nino, okay, coordenador Gra. Feito, se senhora Sera que está balo pergunta cara que está balo que está time de vela no la cosa pergunta senhora madre loca tiana reventa tiana agora tuirtan zetan lehe então lehe então itu Husi gritona ba ida rua tolu hotona. Okay. Resto restantes perguntas depois bele rai hela o café ba mit kulia para tempo dia clio oficial no off the record não se me carga tu kulia. Então por favor Gute depois mai Nino mai Sr. Lamberto.
Thank you. I just have two quick questions. One is in the COVID, post-COVID, the other concept that have been discussed alongside the COVID recovery is the resiliency. So can you elaborate, I mean, how the resiliency in relation to the vulnerability? The second one is about the technology aspect. Sometimes when we watch the war, we watch the how the COVID spread very fast. Sometimes my personal thinking is that sorry to use it, like how dumb as the human beings is to create technology or to invent things that like facilitate the conflict, wars that cost a lot of life. So my question is how vulnerable are we as a human to the technology or to the invention of human being itself? Thank you.
Fausto. Sr. Fausto, Nino, Oxfam.
Thank you, Minister. Thanks very much for the opportunity. I'm Nino, I'm with Oxfam. I do have quite a couple of observations with Starlett's fascinating remarks, but I think because of time, I'll just keep it. We'll probably find another time to talk about it. I guess one quick question for Bishop Gunnar is, when you're sitting in that church in Nairobi and you first heard about Timor, what went through your head in terms of what you envision Timor Leste to be. And now that you're sitting here after 20 years or more than 20 years of restoration of independence, do you see those visions that you had at that time in Nairobi accomplished? And if you could perhaps maybe share a little bit of words of wisdom with us in terms of what you envision now. You've been with Timor for this many years, for the future 20 years. What are the things that you have for Timor? Where do you like to see Timor to be personally? That's just the quick question that I have.
So apart from 20 kilograms later, 20 kg later, Signora Lambert.
Yeah, thank you, Your Excellency, Mr. Fidelis. I want to give my gratitude and honorable to Mr. Gunnar and Starla. I think this room is special and honorable because the first time after COVID-19 we will be realizing our meeting like this to celebrate our national anniversary about the Timorese restoration of independence. Mr. Gunnar, I think when we talk more about the national dialogue and reconciliation, that is important for Timor Leste. And then I met you before, also I listened from you about the Timorese national dialogue and reconciliation is a need to permanently or continue. Because you compare it before 2007 we met, we talk about the Timor Leste and the Guatemala, about the national dialogue and reconciliation and then historical clarification in terms of national dialogue and reconciliation. And I don't think we talk more about the peace or stuff. I think for Timor Leste now is granted peace, and then I hope that this condition will be continued. But my problem in here, I want to ask you about what you think importantly about the moral force and the leadership force for Timor Leste. Because we need the moral force and then leadership force as our perspective for our national development in all aspects. The vulnerability, I think, only depends to answer for this problem is only national development in all aspects. How to transform our society. Only that. Thank you.
Obrigado. Thank you very much for the questions. So we'll go with Professor Starla, then we go, then Bishop Gunnar will make the concluding remarks.
Thank you. COVID crisis has been a real eye-opener and a strange experience of what we have been addressing so far in our discussions of common vulnerability and very much diverse protection of that vulnerability throughout the world. It has been very clear that some have been much worse affected and less protected throughout the crisis than others, and it is no surprise that it is seems to be the same persons and nations and groups of powerful nations and rich nations that have been able to protect themselves or their populations much better than the rest of the world. So although there has been a refrain of none are safe until all are safe, that seems very quickly to be forgotten, sadly. But I think there is a lesson in this which really directs us to key the key expression of our topic today, that autonomy is really not possible as self-isolating in a world of interdependence, be it very clearly shown through the COVID crisis, or be it the climate. So there is a very interesting Italian philosopher whose name is Roberto Esposito, who has written and reflected prior to this COVID crisis about immunity and community. And I think we have been challenged throughout these crises on what is the real relationship between immunity and community. And what Esposito, in very brief terms, is pointing to is that there is a root, a common root to immunity and community, which is the munus. What community is together about, the munus, is responsibility and openness towards the other, to that which is beyond community. And that is actually, immunity is some sense of being freed from that responsibility. That's why an excessive immunity undermines community. So there is an interesting concept of knowing how to be immune without destroying community. And I think that needs to be reflected further on. Just a brief comment on, well, technology is very important in this, and again, we are vulnerable, we are made dependent upon technology, and technology needs to be humanized, needs to be always thought from the perspective of the human needs and the human realities that we're experiencing. And the moral force of leadership, I think that has been raised here as well, is very much at the core of our discussions, that there is a need today for a re-establishing morality at the top and throughout the society. When I come from El Salvador, with a common history of struggle and suffering and liberation as East Timor, I must say it's very sad to see the crisis of the country today, which is a result of the lack of leadership in many ways, of corruption, of the lack of being able to see the shared justice part of society as totally necessary for continuing generations. And I hope and pray that East Timor will be a different example of this, and that's our responsibility, it's your responsibility as leaders and as citizens of Timor to not forget about this morality of shared vulnerability as the core of your autonomy. Thank you.
Thank you. Would you like to give 1 minute of concluding remarks? Concluding remarks. Yes. Just 1 minute, please, before I hand it in.
Well, it's really just to say thank you, because to me it's really inspiring and encouraging to be sharing work in progress and listening to your remarks and your comments and your questions, which I will bring further into my work. I'm writing a book on political theology of vulnerability, and the experiences that you are sharing and the Timorese experiences are certainly questions and inspiration that I take with me into that work. And thank you for receiving us in such a welcoming manner, and thank you, Fidelis, for your leadership and friendship, and I wish you blessings and a lot of interesting and challenging times ahead, but first and foremost, peace and human flourishing for the nation of Timor Leste. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Starla. Bishop?
Thank you. The vision for my engagement here, I think, was shaped by the service in the cathedral on the evening before the popular referendum. I was invited by Bishop Bello to stand by his side in the cathedral, and the church was packed and there were 10,000 of you outside. And Bishop Bello broke I think, liturgical or church rule to give such a prominent place to a clergy from the Lutheran Church. But he invited me to speak, to say a few words that evening in the cathedral, the evening before the referendum. And I sense that as a moment of history for your people and for yourself, but also as an existential experience that never would leave me, where the people, the young and the old, stood there not knowing what would happen when they had given their vote for independence, for freedom, to fulfill the hope and aspirations of generations, but committed to do so. And I was reflecting, I think, in that moment on the experience of our people. 5 years during World War II as a nation occupied by Germany, and the sacrifice of the people who never gave up hope of democracy one day to rule, to be the mode of life. So I want to recapture that moment of resilience and of hope, of determination, of courage, of openness when history is being made. And that moment comes sometimes collectively, as in the cathedral, sometimes personally, individually, as we are sort of visited by the need of the others, as we are embraced by the situation of our contemporary sisters and brothers today, but also as we are conscious of being part of the future. Memory as building stones for the future. Future as reshaping the memories of the past. My dream for East Timor is being fulfilled as you maintain democracy in spite of hiccups, as you develop the health sector in spite of many challenges, and particularly the COVID situation, as you are concerned about employment for the young people and education for the children, as you address the both traditional and social issues impacting the life of women. This is, as Starla said, a process. You are in process. And it would be foolhardy to spell a vision in details, because visions don't come from visitors from abroad, but it comes from the people on the spot. We can share hopes and prayers and well wishes. We can suggest, but the vision are for you to carry. The vision is for you to be fulfilled, and the moment is always now. So take that moment in these days and say, we are turning a new page, if not writing a new chapter, but it is the same book of the same people, the proud and resilient people of East Timor. May God bless that future for you. Thank you.
That's the closing, right? Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Bishop Gunnar. Thank you very much, Professor Starla. Ba audiência hotu, ba participantes hotu, nebe makafo na itabolse de tempo, onde mai participa essa sessão idane. As we all know, Bishop Gunnar has celebrated his 87th birthday, and you must never retire, because once you retire, you'll be busier than when you are working. So we are very pleased and very happy to have Gunnar here, Bishop Gunnar here, and Professor Starla. And I hope that through this session, I'm not going to go and make a summary of the discussions, because I think the discussions went very well and the comments were very profound. So I do not want to do injustice to your beautiful and profound comments and statements. But what I would like to share with you here before I end is that it is possible for us young people to have friends who belong to a different generation. In fact, it is needed. I think it is fundamental. It is critical for the continuation of any society. We learn from their wisdom. We learn from their successes as well as mistakes. But then we capitalize on that to produce or to make a much better world, which will be more just, but also which will not be blind to the vulnerabilities of our fellow human beings. Timor Leste is an independent nation state. We are celebrating tomorrow. We are on the eve of having a new president. But I think it is very important for us to be reminded now and again of the noble objective of independence. That in the end, the people are at the center of this whole endeavor, this whole struggle. That is to bring about a more dignified life to the citizens of the country. We are not perfect. Nobody is perfect. The world is not perfect. Civitas terrena is never perfect. But we can all hope for the best and work to realize all these goals and ambitions. I thank you very much, and this is a celebration of friendship. I cannot thank you enough, and you as well, Starla, and I think this is very beautiful because we have Stalsett Senior and Junior here with us, and both are profound thinkers and a real, true moral compass for Norway and the world. Thank you. Thank you very much, and applause to all of you. And now please.
Politik no